I want to begin with the room, because the room is where everything started, and because I think a story like this one deserves to begin at the point of origin rather than the point of consequence. The room was on the third floor of a house in Galveston, Texas, and it had been sealed, not locked, just sealed. The door frame taped over with brown packing tape, applied so long ago it had dried and contracted and left faint adhesive shadows on the wood. For approximately 11 years before I opened it, the man who had sealed it was Thomas Hale, and Thomas Hale had died in March of last year at the age of 77, and he had left the house, its contents, and a very specific instruction regarding the third floor room to a nephew in Corpus Christi who wanted nothing to do with any of it and had called an estate clearing service, who had called my firm. I run a small company that specializes in audio archive recovery, the cataloging and preservation of private recorded sound collections, reel-to-reel recordings, wire recordings, early consumer tape, shortwave logs, field recordings, private radio communications archives. It is a niche profession, and it attracts a particular kind of client, the family of someone who spent their life in a room full of equipment that nobody else understood. I have catalogued collections of extraordinary historical value and collections of nothing but old test tones and dead air. The work is the same regardless. You inventory, you assess, you preserve. Thomas Hale's nephew told me only that his uncle had been an amateur radio operator since the 1960s, that the third floor room contained an unknown quantity of recording equipment and tape, and that he wanted all of it professionally assessed before he sold the house. He did not mention the instruction Thomas Hale had left in his will regarding the room. I found out about that later, when I was already inside. Thomas Hale's will specified, in language that his attorney described to me as unusually precise for a layman document, that the contents of the third floor room were not to be destroyed, not to be separated from one another, and not to be listened to by anyone who was not a trained audio professional who had been made aware in advance of their general nature. The attorney had interpreted this as a hobbyist's protectiveness over his own work, not unusual among serious radio operators who sometimes treated their recordings with the jealous care of composers protecting unfinished scores. I accepted this interpretation at the time. I removed the tape from the doorframe on a Tuesday morning in April. The adhesive gave with the sound of something very old being opened that had not expected to be opened. The room beyond was the kind of dark that accumulates over years rather than hours. Not just the absence of light, but a thickness in the air, a pressure, as though the room had been holding its breath for 11 years, and I had just given it permission to exhale. I stood in the doorway for a moment and let my eyes adjust. Then I found the light switch. The room was extraordinary. In 30 years of this work, I have seen private radio collections that range from modest to obsessive, and Thomas Hale's fell somewhere off the far end of that scale, in a category I would have to create specifically for him. Every wall was shelving, floor to ceiling, packed with reel-to-reel tape in labeled boxes. The labels were handwritten in a small vertical script, organized by date and frequency. The oldest boxes went back to 1962. The most recent were labeled November 2011. The month before, I would later learn, the room had been sealed. Along the north wall, a workbench held the radio equipment itself, a Hammarland HQ 180 receiver that was probably 40 years old and had been maintained with obvious devotion, a transmitter of matching vintage, a frequency scanner, and a reel-to-reel recorder wired directly into the receiver's output. Everything was connected. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, except the equipment itself, which someone had covered with a drop cloth that had prevented the worst of it. It would take me 6 weeks to fully catalog what was in that room. What I found in those 6 weeks is what I am going to tell you now. Before I get to the recordings, I want to give you Thomas Hale, the man, because I think the recordings make a different kind of sense if you know who was listening. Thomas Hale was born in 1946 in Galveston, Texas, the third of 4 children. His father was a merchant marine radio operator, a detail that becomes relevant, and then more relevant, and then almost unbearably relevant as the story proceeds. He grew up in the house on Strand Street that he would die in 61 years later, and by the time he was 14, he had his amateur radio license and a second-hand shortwave receiver set up in the bedroom his father had once used for the same purpose. His father died at sea in 1960, 2 years before Thomas got his license. He never said, in any document I can find, whether this was a coincidence or a continuation. His neighbors, the few I was able to speak to, who had known him for more than a decade, described him consistently as a solitary man, polite, reliable in the way of people who have simplified their social obligations to a minimum and then fulfill that minimum perfectly. He had worked for 30 years as a civilian communications technician at the Coast Guard station on Galveston Island, monitoring distress frequencies and maintaining communication logs. He retired in 1999. He had never married. He had no children. His life, by all visible accounting, was the house, the job, and the room on the 3rd floor. One neighbor, a woman named Cecilia Ruiz, who had lived next door for 42 years, told me something that I have thought about many times since. She said that in all the years she had known Thomas, she had only once seen him frightened. Not startled, not anxious, genuinely frightened, the way a person looks when something has removed the floor from under their assumptions about the world. It was in 2001, she said. She had passed him on the front walk on a morning in October, and he had looked at her the way a man looks when he is very far away inside himself and has been brought back suddenly and doesn't entirely recognize where he's returned to. She had asked him if he was all right. He had said, and she remembered this precisely, that he had heard something on the radio that he wasn't sure he should have answered. And then he had gone inside. She didn't see him for 3 days after that. When he emerged, he looked, she said, older, not tired, older, as though something had moved through him in those 3 days that had aged him from the inside. I dated that conversation to the autumn of 2001, when I returned to the archive and found the tape boxes from that period. I pulled them first. The recordings from 1962 to approximately 1995 are, in the main, what you would expect from a dedicated amateur radio operator of that generation. Shortwave band monitoring, maritime communications intercepts, atmospheric anomaly logs, the occasional relay of distress traffic. Thomas Hale was a meticulous recorder. He logged every session, date, time, frequency, band conditions, relevant traffic. And he kept the recordings clean and well indexed. Listening to them was like reading the journal of a man who had decided to spend his life paying attention to the world's background noise and had found in that noise something that satisfied him completely. His voice appears occasionally in the early recordings, identifying himself in standard amateur protocol. It's a calm voice, mid-range, with a coastal Texas flatness to it that is neither warm nor cold, but simply direct. A voice accustomed to the discipline of radio communication, where brevity and clarity are not stylistic choices, but professional obligations. He sounds, across those 30 years of tape, like a man who is exactly where he wants to be. The recordings from the mid-90s begin to change. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have alarmed me if I had not been paying very close attention, which is, after all, what I am paid for. The change is in the selection of frequencies he monitors. Through the early part of his recording life, Thomas worked primarily the standard amateur and maritime bands, the frequencies populated by other operators, by ship traffic, by the ordinary communications of a world that was, if one listened carefully enough, always talking to itself. After approximately 1993, he began spending longer and longer sessions monitoring what are known in the radio community as silent frequencies, bands, and specific dial positions that have no assigned use, no registered traffic, no legitimate occupant, dead air, static, and nothing. Every serious radio operator develops an interest in silent frequencies at some point. There is a community of listeners, serious and devoted, who monitor these bands for number stations, for encrypted government transmissions, for the residue of Cold War communications infrastructure that nobody has bothered to officially decommission. Thomas Hale had almost certainly heard of this community. He may have been part of it, but what he was looking for on the silent frequencies, from 1993 onward, with increasing focus and increasing hours, was not any of those things. I know this because of what he found in 1996. On the evening of March 14th, 1996, Thomas Hale was monitoring a frequency in the upper shortwave band that had no designation, no registered occupant, no traffic of any kind in any log I can find. He had been monitoring it on and off for approximately 18 months. His session log for that evening notes the start time as 8:47 in the evening and the band conditions as poor. High atmospheric noise, significant static, low signal propagation, standard for late winter evenings on the Gulf Coast. He would normally have noted the band conditions and moved on to a clearer frequency. He did not move on. At 9:22 in the evening, the recording captures a change in the static, not a voice, not at first, something more fundamental, a shift in the quality of the noise itself, as though the static had been reorganized around an absence. The way a crowd shifts to accommodate the arrival of someone moving through it, and then, embedded in that reorganized noise, a signal. I have listened to that recording more times than I can accurately count, and I want to describe it to you as precisely as language allows, because imprecision here would be a kind of lie. The signal is not Morse code, although it has a rhythmic quality that superficially resembles code. It is not voice transmission, although it contains frequencies in the range of human speech. It is not any known form of digital data encoding that I have been able to identify, and I have consulted 3 signal analysis specialists, none of whom could identify it either. What it sounds like, if I am forced to use an analogy, is the sound of a voice that has been recorded, and then the recording has been left running for a very long time in a very bad environment, so that the original signal has been compressed and degraded and smeared across the frequency band until the shape of a voice remains, but the voice itself is unrecoverable. A voice-shaped absence. A voice-shaped static. It transmits for 11 minutes and 40 seconds. Then it stops. Thomas Hale said nothing on the recording for a long time after it stopped. The tape ran, the static returned to its ordinary texture, and then he said, in a voice that I had to replay 3 times to confirm I had heard correctly, quietly, with a measured calm that cost him something, I think, to produce. He said his own name, first name, last name, Thomas Hale, as though he were identifying himself to the signal, as though he were answering it. He logged the session. He labeled the tape. He put it on the shelf. He went back to the same frequency the following evening, and the evening after that, and every evening for the next 3 weeks. The signal did not return. It returned in August of 1997. Same frequency, same quality. This time, 16 minutes long. And this time, Thomas Hale had been waiting for it. His session notes for the summer of 1997 show him monitoring the frequency for 6 to 8 hours a night, every night, for 4 months before the signal appeared. When it did, he was ready. He had, in the intervening year, built a custom filter circuit that he wired between the receiver and the recorder. A circuit designed according to the handwritten schematic I found in a drawer of the workbench to isolate and amplify frequencies in the range of human speech while suppressing surrounding noise. The 1997 recording passed through that filter is different from the 1996 one. The signal is the same voice-shaped static, the same rhythm that is almost but not quite code, the same quality of something that was once a voice and has been left somewhere for a long time and is no longer entirely a voice. But through the filter, in certain passages, there are fragments, not words. I want to be very clear about this, because I have been asked, and I have thought about it carefully, and they are not words. But they are not words either. They are the shapes that words leave behind when everything that made them words has been removed. Phoneme fragments, the architecture of speech without its substance. The memory of a voice rather than the voice itself. I identified 47 such fragments across the 16-minute recording. I extracted each one. I brought in a linguist from the University of Texas who specializes in degraded speech recovery, the kind of work done in forensic audio when a recording has been damaged or partially destroyed. She worked with the fragments for 2 weeks. She could not reconstruct any complete words, but she identified the phoneme clusters with confidence, and she told me that if she had to characterize the language of origin based on the fragmentary evidence available, she would say English, American English, coastal dialect. She said it with the particular care of a professional who knows how slim her margin for error should be. And she said it twice to make sure I had heard her. Thomas Hale did not know any of this in 1997. He had no linguist, no signal analysis software, no peer consultation. He had his ears and his filter circuit and his 48 years of listening to radio signals, and whatever he heard in those fragments, whatever he assembled in his own mind from the voice-shaped static on that frequency, was enough. His session log for the night of August 19th, 1997, the night of the second recording, contains a single notation in the margin beside the timestamp. The notation says, "Dad." I want to pause here and speak carefully about what I think Thomas Hale understood and believed, because I think it is important, and because I think it has been easy, in the telling of stories like this one, to characterize the person at the center as unhinged, as a lonely, bereaved man who projected the voice of his dead father onto the static of a shortwave receiver and built an elaborate private mythology around the projection. I want to resist that characterization, not because I am certain it is wrong, but because I am not certain it is right. And in the absence of certainty, I think the most honest thing I can do is describe what the evidence shows and let the listener hold the uncertainty alongside me. What the evidence shows is this: Thomas Hale was a trained communications technician with decades of professional experience in the analysis and logging of radio signals. He was not a credulous man. His session logs from 1962 onward are models of skeptical precision. He noted anomalies without interpreting them, flagged ambiguous signals without assigning meaning, and consistently distinguished between what the recording showed and what he thought it might mean. He was, professionally and temperamentally, a person who understood the distance between a signal and its interpretation. And yet, in the autumn of 1997, he began to keep a second set of notebooks alongside the session logs. These notebooks, 6 of them, accumulated between 1997 and 2011, are not technical documents. They are not logs. They are the private record of what Thomas Hale believed he was hearing on that frequency, and what he believed it meant. His father, Martin Hale, had died in 1960 aboard a merchant vessel in the North Atlantic. The ship was the MV Callaway, a grain freighter out of Houston, and it went down in a winter storm on the 17th of November, 1960. 14 men were lost, including Martin Hale, who was the vessel's radio operator. No bodies were recovered. Thomas was 14 years old. Thomas Hale spent the next 37 years becoming, in every technical sense, what his father had been. He learned the same equipment. He worked the same frequencies. He spent a career at a Coast Guard communication station, doing, in an official capacity, exactly what his father had done on a merchant ship. He never spoke about this correspondence publicly. The notebooks are the first place he wrote about it at all, and he wrote about it obliquely even there, not as grief, not as tribute, but as a kind of technical hypothesis. He wrote that his father had been, at the moment of the Callaway's sinking, transmitting a distress signal on the maritime emergency frequency. He wrote that the distress signal had been logged, partially received by a Coast Guard station in Newfoundland, and then lost as the ship went down. He wrote that he had wondered, for 37 years, what happened to a signal when the source was destroyed, before the transmission was complete. He wrote, A signal does not require a physical transmitter to persist. It requires only a medium and a frequency. What we call dead air is never actually silent. It is full of signals that have no source anymore, degraded to noise by distance and time. I have spent my life listening to what should be empty frequencies. I do not think they are empty. I think they are full of signals that have been traveling so long, nobody remembers their origin. I think that is what I hear on this band. I think it is my father, still transmitting. He wrote this without apparent distress. He wrote it with the measured, technical voice of a man articulating a hypothesis that he has tested and cannot disprove. Between 1997 and 2001, the signal appeared 7 more times on the same frequency. Thomas was there for all 7 sessions. His filter circuit became increasingly sophisticated with each iteration. He rebuilt it twice, each time improving the isolation of the speech range frequencies, each time recovering more of the fragments that the linguist would later confirm were shaped like American English. What he heard in those fragments, the notebooks tell us, was not a coherent message. It was a presence, a quality of transmission, the specific texture of a voice he had heard daily for 14 years, and then not heard for 37. That accumulated across the recordings into something he called recognition. He wrote, "I know a signal from a voice, and I know a voice from a person. What I hear on this frequency is a person. I cannot explain the mechanism. I have stopped trying to explain the mechanism. I am a technician. I log what I receive." The signal appeared for the 9th time on the evening of October 3rd, 2001. It appeared at 9:15 in the evening, on the same frequency it had always used, in the same voice-shaped static, with the same fragmentary quality that Thomas had spent 5 years learning to pass. His session log notes band conditions as excellent, unusually clear for that time of year, low atmospheric noise, strong signal propagation. Whatever was transmitting cleanly, by its own standards. He noted the start time. He started the recorder. He settled in. The session lasted, according to the tape, 4 hours and 17 minutes. This was not unusual by itself. Thomas had sat through long sessions before, monitoring a frequency long after its traffic had ended in case something returned. What was unusual was what happened in the second hour. At 11:43 in the evening, the signal changed. I have played that passage many times, and I will describe it as exactly as I can. The signal had been proceeding in its characteristic way. The rhythmic, voice-shaped static, the fragmentary phoneme clusters embedded in the noise. When it interrupted itself, there is a pause of approximately 4 seconds, a silence in which the static drops to almost nothing, a silence of a quality and completeness that is, in my experience with radio recordings, deeply wrong. Static does not simply stop. Atmospheric noise is constant and omnidirectional. A silence of that completeness on a shortwave frequency means something is suppressing the background signal, which is not a thing that should be possible with the equipment and physics involved. In that silence, the signal changed direction. What had been a transmission became, in the second hour of that session, something that I can only describe as a question, not a question in any language. The voice-shaped static is not language, has never been language in any recoverable sense. But the quality of the signal shifted from broadcast to inquiry, from the outward-facing posture of a transmission into the open air, to something with an orientation, a direction, a target. The rhythm changed. The frequency distribution within the signal shifted. And in the shift, if you listened for long enough and had spent 5 years learning the shape of this particular signal, you could hear not words, but something underneath words, something more fundamental than words. You could hear that it had noticed him, that it had, at some point in the 4 years it had been appearing on this band, become aware that it was being received. Thomas Hale sat in the room on the 3rd floor and listened to this for 56 minutes. The session log shows no notes taken during this period. The log entries simply stop at 11:43 and resume at 12:39. What happened in that 56 minutes? Lives only in the recording. At 12:39, Thomas Hale did what his own training, what every standard protocol in amateur and professional radio operation, what simple received wisdom among the community of people who monitored silent frequencies had always told him never to do. He transmitted. He turned on the transmitter. He set it to the same frequency. He keyed the microphone, and into the silence of a dead band that had no legitimate occupant, into a frequency that should not have carried anything and had been carrying the same degraded signal for 5 years. He said his name, first name, last name, Thomas Hale, the same words he had said in 1996 when the signal first appeared, but then under his breath, into an open room, unkeyed, this time into the transmitter, this time on the frequency, this time answered. The signal stopped the moment he keyed the microphone. The dead air returned. Thomas waited. The session log shows him waiting for 1 hour and 4 minutes before he closed the session and stopped the recorder. In that time, nothing came back. The frequency was empty. The silence was complete. He sealed the room 3 months later. In the final notebook, the one that ends in November 2011, the month the room was closed, there is an entry from October 4th, the morning after the session. It is brief. He writes, "The band has changed. I have been monitoring since 4 this morning. The signal did not return last night, but the frequency is not the same as it was. The silence on it is different. A room is different after someone has walked through it than it was before. Even if you come back the next day and the person is gone, the frequency is different. I walked through it. I should not have walked through it." He writes, in smaller letters below this, "I do not know what I gave it when I transmitted. A signal carries information whether you intend it to or not. It carries the shape of the equipment, the power of the source, the location, and the time. It carries the voice of the operator. I have been a technician all my life. I know that a signal is not just a message. It is a position. I told it where I was. I gave it something to find." He stopped the entry there. There is no following entry for 11 days. When the notebook resumes on October 15th, his handwriting has changed. Still controlled, still vertical, but smaller, more compressed. The letters pressed closer together, as though he were trying to take up less space on the page. He writes about ordinary things, the weather, a repair needed on the front gutters, the cost of a replacement component for the receiver, He does not mention the signal or the transmission again in the October entries. But from October 2001 onward, for the next 10 years, until the room was sealed, he monitored the frequency every night without exception, for 10 years. The tapes recorded the hiss of the band, the atmospheric noise, the patient presence of a man at a receiver who has transmitted his location into the dark and is waiting to find out what heard him. He never heard the signal again. That is not, however, the same as saying nothing happened. The tapes from 2002 onward are different from everything that preceded them, and the difference is not in the signal, because there is no signal, not one, not once, across 10 years and thousands of hours of recording. The difference is in Thomas Hale, in the quality of his silence, in the sound of a man sitting very still in a room for 10 years, listening to a frequency that gives him nothing back and not leaving. I said earlier that I have spent 30 years in this work, that I have catalogued collections that ranged from the mundane to the remarkable, and that is true. But I have never before sat with a recording and felt, as I felt sitting with the later Hale tapes, that the most significant thing on the recording was the person doing the recording. Thomas Hale on the 1970s tapes sounds like a man at work. Thomas Hale on the 1990s tapes sounds like a man on the edge of a discovery he can feel but not see. Thomas Hale on the post-2001 tapes sounds like a man who has made a decision he cannot unmake and is living with the weight of it one night at a time. He does not speak on the later recordings. In the early years, he had occasionally logged his observations aloud, a shorthand, faster than writing, for noting band conditions and signal events. After 2001, he stopped. Hours pass on those tapes without a sound from him. Just the static, just the frequency, just the evidence that someone is present, waiting because the recorder is running and the session log shows the start and end times, and they are his handwriting. In 2004, he filed a report with the FCC about an unlicensed transmission he claimed to have observed on the frequency. The report was brief, technically correct, and deliberately devoid of any suggestion of what he thought the signal was. The FCC investigated and found no evidence of unlicensed transmission activity on the band. They noted that the frequency in question showed unusually high atmospheric noise for its position in the spectrum, but attributed this to geomagnetic activity. They closed the report. Thomas received the closure letter in July 2004 and filed it in a folder in the workbench drawer. He continued his nightly monitoring. In 2007, according to his medical records, which his nephew, who was also his legal next of kin, gave me access to after some persuasion, Thomas Hale presented to his family physician, complaining of a symptom he described in the consultation notes as hearing things that were not there. He described it as low frequency, below the range of ordinary hearing, felt more than heard, present, particularly at night, and particularly when he was in an enclosed space. His physician noted no significant findings on examination, attributed the symptom to age-related changes in auditory perception, combined with occupational noise exposure over his career, and recommended he reduce the amount of time spent near broadcasting equipment. Thomas thanked him, collected the prescription for mild anti-anxiety medication that the doctor had written just in case, and never filled it. He did not reduce the time spent near the equipment. The 2007 and 2008 tapes run to the same hours as always. But the session logs from 2007 onward contained something the earlier logs did not. In the margin of each nightly entry, beside the end time, a brief notation, always the same notation, night after night for 4 years. 2 words, still here. I spent a long time with those 2 words. I considered the possibilities. A notation that the signal had not returned. Still here, meaning it had still not come. Still present in its absence. An assessment of his own state. Still here, meaning I am still in this room. I am still doing this. I am still the person who made that transmission and is waiting for its consequence. A report to some imagined reader of the log. Still here, meaning I want you to know I have not left. I asked myself which of these Thomas had intended, and I could not answer the question. And I think that ambiguity may have been intentional. I think he may have been writing it for all 3 meanings simultaneously, and for one additional meaning that I kept returning to despite myself. Still here, meaning whatever I called to that frequency is still here with me. In November 2011, he made the last entry in the last notebook. It is 3 sentences. He writes, I have been listening to this band for 15 years and transmitting on it for 10, and I have not heard the signal again. Whatever answered my transmission, I do not believe it answered in kind. I believe it answered in a different register entirely. And I have been hearing the answer for 10 years in the low frequency the doctor could not measure. And I am tired now, and I am going to close the room and live with whatever I brought back with me from that frequency. For however long I have left, he sealed the room the following week. He lived for another 11 years. His neighbor said he was kind and solitary and never went near a radio again. I finished cataloging the Hale archive in 6 weeks. As I said, the nephew received a full inventory, an assessment of the historical and technical value of the collection, and a recommendation that the recordings be donated to the Gulf Coast Maritime Communications Archive at Texas A&M, where they would be preserved and made available to researchers. The nephew agreed. The collection was transferred in July. I have not told the archivists at Texas A&M everything I have told you. I told them the collection was the work of a dedicated amateur operator with an unusual focus on anomalous signal phenomena. I told them the recordings were technically significant. I told them the collection was complete and should be kept intact in accordance with Thomas Hale's stated wishes. I did not tell them what the signal sounded like, because I did not think I could describe it in language that would not make me sound like a man who had spent too long alone in a room full of other people's recordings. I did not tell them about the notebooks or what Thomas believed, because those are personal documents, and his beliefs were his own. I did not tell them what I heard on the last night I spent in the 3rd floor room. On my final evening at the house, after I had finished the inventory and boxed the last of the reels for transport, I sat at the workbench. I am not certain why. Partly professional habit, the instinct to sit in a room before you leave it and make sure you have not missed anything. Partly something harder to name. The room had a quality I had not encountered in 30 years of similar work. A quality that I'm going to describe as presence, with the full awareness that the word is imprecise and that I distrust imprecision. The room felt inhabited, not in the sense of occupied. It was empty except for me, in the sense of a space that had been lived in so completely and for so long by a single attention that the attention had left a residue. The quality of a person in a room after they have left. I sat at the workbench for a while. The receiver was still connected, still powered. I had not intended to turn it on. I had gone over the equipment in the first week and confirmed it was functional, and that confirmation was all the professional obligation required. I had no reason to turn it on. I turned it on. I set it to the frequency, Thomas Hale's frequency, the one that appears in the session logs from 1995 onward, the one he had monitored for 16 years and transmitted on once, and then returned to every night for a decade. I set it to that frequency, and I put on the monitor headphones that were still hanging on their hook beside the workbench, and I listened. What I heard for the first several minutes was ordinary, the static of an empty band, atmospheric noise, the background radiation of a frequency that nobody uses for anything, and that contains, as all frequencies contain, the accumulated noise of a century of radio transmission that has traveled until the source is gone, and only the traveling remains. Ordinary, expected. I sat with it for perhaps 10 minutes, long enough to confirm that there was nothing there, which was what I had expected to confirm. And then I reached for the dial to turn the receiver off. I did not turn it off. I am a careful person. I do not attach meaning to coincidence. I do not interpret pattern in noise. I do not have any investment in the supernatural or the inexplicable. And my professional life has given me ample opportunity to develop these habits and to see the cost of abandoning them. I am telling you this so that you understand what it means when I tell you what happened next. The static changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that would register on a spectrograph as other than an ordinary fluctuation in atmospheric noise. But I'd been listening to radio static for 30 years, and I'd spent 6 weeks listening to Thomas Hale's recordings of this specific frequency, and I know what ordinary atmospheric fluctuation sounds like, and what I heard in the headphones in the last 10 minutes. I sat in that room was not that. It was quiet, beneath the noise, below the threshold of what I would have called a signal by any technical definition, a frequency distribution within the static that was fractionally, almost negligibly wrong, concentrated in the speech range, rhythmic in a way that was almost but not quite pattern, voice-shaped. I sat very still. I have thought about those minutes many times since, and I have tried to be honest about what I experienced and what I interpreted, and how much of each was trustworthy. What I experienced was a change in the static. What I interpreted, in the room, in the dark, at the workbench of a man who had spent 50 years building toward a single moment of transmission, and then lived with its aftermath for a decade. What I interpreted was that something on that frequency was doing exactly what Thomas Hale had described in the notebooks, orienting, shifting from the outward-facing posture of a broadcast to something with a direction, a target. I took off the headphones. I turned off the receiver. I stood up from the workbench, and I walked out of the room, and I did not look back. I did not reseal the door. I left that for the estate clearing team. I drove back to my hotel and I sat in a lit room for a long time, and I thought about Thomas Hale sealing that door in November 2011 and living for 11 more years with whatever he had brought back from the frequency. And I thought about his notation in the margins of the session logs. Still here, every night for 4 years. And I thought about what it meant to be a man whose entire professional life had been spent listening, and who, at the end, had heard something that could not be explained by the frequency response curves and atmospheric propagation models and signal analysis tools that had organized his understanding of the world. I thought about what it means to listen for something long enough that it begins to listen back. The collection is at Texas A&M now, catalogued and archived and available to researchers. I have submitted the collection description and the technical assessment and the recommended preservation protocols. I have not submitted the notebooks. They are in a box in my office, and I have not decided yet what to do with them. Thomas Hale's instruction was that the contents of the room not be destroyed, not be separated, and not be listened to by anyone who had not been made aware of their general nature. He did not specify what being made aware of their general nature should feel like. I suspect he knew it would feel like this, like holding something that is heavier than it looks, and not being entirely certain whether the weight is in the thing or in you. The frequency is still there. It will always be there. Frequencies do not go away simply because you stop transmitting on them, and they do not go quiet simply because you stop listening. They persist in the medium as all signals persist, carrying whatever they carry for as long as the medium holds, which is, in the case of a radio frequency, in the open air, which is to say, in the electromagnetic field that surrounds and interpenetrates everything, which is to say, in the one medium that has no edge and no bottom and no point at which it runs out, which is to say, forever. Thomas Hale understood this. He spent his life understanding it. He built his life around it, and then, once, he broke the protocol that every serious operator knows and answered something that was not meant to be answered. And for the rest of his life, he sat in a room and listened to the consequence. What I keep coming back to, in the end, is not the signal. It is the notation in the margins. Still here, night after night, for 4 years, the same 2 words beside the closing time of each session. A report, an acknowledgement, a statement of fact addressed to no particular reader, about no particular subject, that somehow contained, in its brevity, everything Thomas Hale had learned from 50 years of listening. He was still there. It was still there, after everything, after the transmission, after the decade of silence, after the room was closed and the receiver was dark. Both of them still here. I think that is the only kind of contact that static ever permits. Not exchange, not conversation, just the mutual knowledge of a presence on the other end of a frequency that should be empty and isn't, the faintest possible signal, the minimum viable evidence that something is there. For most people, that would not be enough. For Thomas Hale, I believe it was everything. If this story crawled under your skin, make sure to subscribe and leave a like. It helps the channel stay alive. But more importantly, tell me in the comments, Do you believe this was actually real? I'll be down there reading.